Jasmine Porter stood in the grand foyer of the Whitmore estate, clutching the strap of her worn-out purse as she stared up at the massive chandelier that glittered like a sky full of stars. She had never seen anything like this in her life. The ceilings stretched impossibly high, the walls were lined with expensive artwork, and the polished marble floors gleamed beneath her scuffed sneakers. This was a mistake, a huge mistake. She didn't belong here, but she needed the job. "Miss Porter, I assume," a deep voice cut through the silence. Jasmine turned sharply, her breath catching as she took in the man standing before her. Victor Langston, the man who had hired her. The man who, according to every business magazine in existence, was a self-made millionaire who controlled half the luxury hotels on the East Coast. And he was staring at her like she was an inconvenience. Victor was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a tailored black suit that probably cost more than her entire life. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his sharp jawline clean-shaven, and his blue eyes were piercing, calculating. "You're late," he said, tapping his expensive watch. Jasmine swallowed hard. "There was traffic." His brow lifted slightly, as if he found the excuse unoriginal. "I don't tolerate tardiness," he said coldly, folding his arms. "I need someone reliable, someone efficient." "If you can't handle that, then this isn't the place for you." Jasmine stiffened. "I can handle it." Victor studied her for a long moment, those sharp eyes assessing her like she was some kind of business transaction. "Fine," he said finally. "Follow me." She exhaled and hurried after him as he led her through the estate. The house was practically a palace, endless hallways, rooms filled with expensive furniture, grand staircases that looked like something out of a movie. "This job is simple," Victor said as they walked. "You clean, you organize, you stay out of my way." Jasmine bit back a retort. She needed this job too badly to snap at him, no matter how arrogant he sounded. He pushed open a door, revealing a massive kitchen with sleek black marble countertops and state-of-the-art appliances. "You start here, the staff will show you your responsibilities." And just like that, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Jasmine standing there, gripping the strap of her bag like a lifeline. This was going to be harder than she thought. The first few days were rough. Victor was distant, barely acknowledging her presence. He was always working on the phone, in meetings, locked in his office. He never smiled, never made small talk. But Jasmine noticed things, like how he drank his coffee black, no sugar. How he spent late nights in his study, staring at papers with a tense expression. How, despite having all the money in the world, there was something deeply lonely about him. She shouldn't care, but she did. One evening, she was finishing up in the kitchen when she heard a crash from Victor's study. Frowning, she hesitated before walking toward the sound. The door was slightly ajar, and when she peeked inside, she saw him standing behind his desk, his hand clenched into a fist. A glass of whiskey lay shattered on the floor. "Are you okay?" She asked cautiously. Victor's jaw tightened. "Did I ask for company?" Jasmine crossed her arms. "No, but you just broke a glass, so forgive me for checking." He let out a humorless chuckle and ran a hand through his hair. "It's nothing." "It doesn't look like nothing." There was a beat of silence. Then, to her surprise, he sighed and sank into his chair, rubbing his temples. "Business is a mess," he muttered. "People I trusted," he cut himself off, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter." Jasmine hesitated before stepping inside. "You know, you don't have to be a millionaire to understand betrayal." His eyes snapped to hers, something flickering in his gaze. For the first time, she felt like he was really looking at her. "Is that so?" he asked. Jasmine nodded. "Yeah, and for what it's worth, breaking glasses won't fix anything." A slow exhale left his lips, and then, to her shock, the corners of his mouth lifted just slightly. "Noted," she smiled. "Good, now let me clean this up before you step on it." Victor didn't argue, and for the first time since she started working here, she saw something in him other than cold indifference. Maybe, just maybe, There was more to Victor Langston than the ruthless millionaire everyone thought he was. Jasmine had expected Victor to retreat back into his cold, distant demeanor after that night, but something had shifted. He still wasn't friendly, not by a long shot, but his silence felt different now, less like a dismissal and more like hesitation. As if he wasn't used to people seeing past the polished surface of his world. The change was subtle at first. He would linger a little longer in the kitchen when she was there, watching her as she worked. Once, when she was organizing the books in the library, she caught him standing in the doorway, observing her with an unreadable expression before he disappeared again without a word. And then there were the mornings he always rose early. But now, she found him in the kitchen at the same time she started her day, nursing a coffee while she wiped down the counters. She never mentioned it. She wasn't sure he even realized he was doing it, but she noticed. One afternoon, while dusting the sitting room, she heard voices from down the hall. Victor's was low and clipped, but the other man's was louder, more insistent. "You're making a mistake," the visitor said. Victor's response was curt. "I don't need your advice, Richard." Curiosity got the better of her, and she took a cautious step closer. Through the slightly open door, she could see them standing opposite each other, tension thick in the air. Richard was older, dressed just as sharply as Victor, but where Victor carried himself with restrained control, Richard's expression was smug. "You're not thinking clearly," Richard continued. "You're letting emotions get in the way of business. That's not like you." Victor's jaw tightened. "I said no." Richard let out a slow breath and shook his head. "Suit yourself. But don't expect me to clean up your mess when this all falls apart." With that, he strode past her without a glance, leaving Victor standing rigid in the office. Jasmine hesitated before stepping inside. "Who was that?" Victor didn't look at her right away. "A former associate." "Seems like he thinks you're making a mistake," Victor exhaled sharply. "That's his opinion." She leaned against the doorway. "And what's yours?" He finally met her gaze, something flickering behind his eyes. "That I'd rather lose money than lose my soul." The words surprised her. She had assumed men like him put business above everything else, yet here he was, rejecting whatever deal had been presented to him because of something deeper. "You don't seem like the type to make reckless decisions," she said. A humorless chuckle escaped him. "You sound like you know me," she shrugged. "Maybe I'm starting to." For a long moment, he just looked at her, as if trying to decide whether that idea unsettled or intrigued him. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Jasmine wasn't sure what to make of it. Later that evening, she found herself alone in the garden, taking in the peaceful stillness of the estate grounds. The sky was painted in deep shades of purple and gold, the scent of blooming jasmine drifting through the air. It was one of the only places on the estate that didn't feel overwhelming, a quiet escape from the grandeur of everything else. She wasn't expecting company, which was why she was startled when Victor appeared beside her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his dark slacks. "You spend a lot of time out here," he observed. She glanced at him, "And you don't seem like the type to notice where a housekeeper spends her time." A corner of his mouth lifted just slightly. "I notice more than you think." The admission sent a strange warmth through her, but she pushed it aside. "It's peaceful here. It doesn't feel so suffocating." His expression shifted, something shadowed passing through his features. "You think this life is suffocating?" She hesitated, then nodded. "A little. Everything is so polished, perfect." "It's beautiful, but it doesn't feel real." Victor was silent for a long moment before he murmured, "It isn't." The words hung between them, heavier than she expected. For the first time, she realized that maybe, just maybe, Victor Langston wasn't as untouchable as he seemed. Jasmine turned over in bed, staring at the ceiling of her small room in the east wing of the estate. She hadn't been able to shake the way Victor had looked at her in the garden, the weight behind his words. It wasn't the first time she had caught glimpses of something raw beneath his carefully controlled exterior, but tonight had been different, more vulnerable. Sleep never came easily after nights like these, when her mind was too tangled with thoughts of him, of the push and pull between them. There were moments when he was as distant as ever, a man wrapped in his own world, closed off and untouchable. But then there were the other moments, the ones where his guard slipped, where his gaze lingered too long, where his words held meaning beyond what he let on. She told herself it didn't matter. And yet she knew it did. The next morning, Jasmine threw herself into work, determined to focus on anything other than Victor Langston. She scrubbed tiles, dusted bookshelves, polished the silverware until it gleamed. Anything to keep her hands and mind busy, but avoiding him was impossible. Late in the afternoon, while she was arranging fresh flowers in the main sitting room, she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The air shifted when he was near, something about his presence commanding attention without a single word. She continued placing the delicate white lilies into the vase, pretending she didn't notice him standing there. "You have a habit of making things look effortless," Victor said. Jasmine didn't pause. "It's just flowers." "It's more than that," he replied. "Everything you do with care." She finally turned, meeting his gaze. "Is that surprising?" His expression was unreadable. Not many people care about things that aren't theirs. Something about the way he said it made her chest tighten. "Maybe it's not about ownership," she said. "Maybe it's just about doing the right thing." A flicker of something passed through his eyes, but before she could decipher it, he glanced toward the window. "I have a meeting in the city tonight." She nodded, unsure why he was telling her. "I want you to come with me," he added, her hands stilled on the vase. "What?" "You'll be accompanying me," he said matter-of-factly. "There will be an event after the meeting, and I need someone I trust there." She let out a short laugh. "Since when do you trust me?" His gaze didn't waver. "Since you told me the truth when no one else would." Jasmine opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. It wasn't a request. And despite knowing she should refuse, something inside her whispered that this was more than just an errand. It was an invitation into his world. That evening, Jasmine stood in front of a full-length mirror, staring at the dress that had arrived in her room just an hour before. It was deep sapphire, the kind of gown that belonged in a ballroom, not on someone like her. The material was soft against her skin, the cut elegant, the fit perfect as if it had been made just for her. She had no doubt it had been. When she finally stepped outside, Victor was waiting near the entrance, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked as effortlessly refined as everything else in his life. His gaze swept over her, his expression unreadable. But for the first time since she had met him, he seemed momentarily lost for words. Then, as if catching himself, he extended a hand. "Shall we?" Jasmine hesitated, then placed her fingers in his. The moment she did, something shifted. The city was alive with lights and movement. But inside the private club where Victor's meeting was held, the atmosphere was quieter, more controlled. Men in tailored suits, women in designer dresses, conversations spoken in hushed tones over glasses of expensive champagne. Jasmine had never felt more out of place. Yet Victor never let go of her hand. He led her through the room with the confidence of a man who belonged, who commanded attention without ever asking for it. And with his grip firm around hers, she found that she didn't feel as small as she expected to. The meeting itself was brief, a discussion over contracts and investments. Jasmine barely understood half of what was said, but she noticed Victor's restraint, the way he listened before speaking, the way his presence alone demanded respect. When it was over, they moved to a lounge area where soft music played and glasses clinked. She felt his gaze on her before she even turned. "You're quiet," he observed. Jasmine met his eyes. "I don't belong here," he tilted his head slightly. "Who told you that?" She let out a breath. "Come on, Victor, look around. This isn't my world." His expression darkened slightly, as if something about her words unsettled him. "You think this is my world?" She hesitated. "Isn't it?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, his voice quieter, he said, "Not everything is as it seems, Jasmine." She wanted to ask what he meant, but before she could, a woman approached. Tall, poised, effortlessly elegant. "Someone who did belong here." "Victor," she said smoothly, "it's been a while." Jasmine felt his posture stiffen beside her. "Natalie," he said, his tone cool. The woman's gaze flicked to Jasmine, curiosity and something sharper in her expression. "And who is this?" Victor's grip on Jasmine's hand tightened slightly before he said, "Someone who matters." The words sent a jolt through her. Natalie arched a brow but didn't press. Instead, she gave a knowing smile. "Well, I hope you know what you're doing," she said before turning and disappearing into the crowd. Jasmine exhaled. "Who was that?" Victor's jaw was tense. "A mistake." Something about the way he said it sent a chill down her spine. She wanted to ask more, but before she could, he turned to her, his expression unreadable once more. "Are you ready to leave?" She nodded, and without another word, he led her out. But as they stepped into the waiting car, Jasmine knew one thing for certain. She wasn't just a housekeeper anymore. She was something more, and she wasn't sure whether that terrified or thrilled her. The drive back from the city was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Victor's hand rested on the seat between them, close enough that Jasmine could feel the warmth radiating from him. She wasn't sure what had changed between them tonight, but something had. There was no denying it. She turned to look at him, taking in the sharp angles of his face, the way the city lights flickered against his skin. His expression was unreadable, but his posture wasn't as rigid as usual. He was thinking about something, and whatever it was, it weighed on him. She wanted to ask. To break the silence and make sense of the tension humming between them, but before she could, he spoke. "I never planned on this," he said, voice low. She frowned. "On what?" His gaze stayed on the road ahead. "On you." Her breath caught. Victor exhaled, his fingers flexing slightly. "You walked into my life, and suddenly everything I thought I wanted felt different." Jasmine's heart pounded against her ribs. She should look away, should pretend this wasn't happening, but she couldn't. "Victor, I don't let people in," he continued. "Not like this, not ever." She swallowed hard. "Then why me?" He finally turned to her, and for the first time there was no hesitation in his eyes, no walls, just raw, unfiltered truth. "Because you see me," he said. "Not the money, not the reputation, just me." The words sent a shiver through her. No one had ever said something like that to her before. No one had ever looked at her the way he did now, as if she was something rare and irreplaceable. She didn't realize she was holding her breath until the car slowed in front of the estate. The moment shattered as the driver opened the door and reality came rushing back in. Victor stepped out first, but before she could follow, his hand was there, reaching for hers. She didn't hesitate. The night air was crisp as they walked toward the entrance, their footsteps the only sound in the vast stillness of the property. But just as they reached the steps, Victor paused. Without thinking, Jasmine turned to him. And in the quiet, in the space between heartbeats, he reached up and brushed his fingers against her cheek. She froze, her skin burning under his touch. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Her heart ached at the vulnerability in his eyes. "Neither do I," she said. For a moment it was just them. Just the weight of everything left unsaid. Then, as if deciding something in that very second, Victor closed the distance between them. His lips met hers, slow and deliberate, a question and an answer all at once. Jasmine melted against him, her hands gripping the front of his suit as if she was afraid he might disappear. But he didn't. He pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, as if he had been waiting for this just as long as she had. When they finally broke apart, his forehead rested against hers, his breath uneven. "This changes everything," he murmured. She nodded. "I know," and she did. There was no going back now. Victor didn't pull away immediately. His fingers traced a slow path down Jasmine's arm before finally letting go, leaving behind a warmth that lingered even in the cool night air. Neither of them spoke as they stepped back into the house, the electric charge between them undeniable. Jasmine's heart was still racing as she walked toward the east wing, but before she could disappear down the hallway, Victor's voice stopped her. "Jasmine." She turned, finding him standing in the dimly lit foyer, his expression unreadable. "Tomorrow," he said, "I want you to come with me again." Her brows lifted slightly. "Where?" He hesitated, as if weighing something important. "Somewhere I should have taken you sooner." There was a promise in his words, something beyond business meetings and extravagant events. "Something personal." Jasmine nodded, and without another word, she slipped away for the night. The next afternoon, Victor was waiting for her by the sleek black car parked in the driveway. This time, he wasn't dressed in a suit. His usual polished exterior was replaced with something more relaxed: dark jeans, a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. It was the first time she had seen him without the carefully curated armor of wealth and power. She slid into the passenger seat, curious but silent as he pulled onto the road. The estate faded behind them as they drove through winding streets, past towering buildings and bustling sidewalks. Jasmine studied Victor's face as he navigated the city, his jaw set, his focus unwavering. He hadn't told her where they were going, but it became clear soon enough. The car pulled to a stop in front of an old building, its brick facade worn but sturdy. A small sign above the entrance read Langston Youth Center. Jasmine turned toward him, surprise flickering in her eyes. "This is yours," Victor exhaled, gripping the steering wheel for a moment before answering. "It was my father's. He started it before he passed. I took over after him." She hadn't expected this. The Victor Langston she had come to know was a man of control, of precision. He didn't reveal parts of himself easily, and yet, here he was, cracking open a door to his past. He stepped out of the car and she followed, taking in the space around her. Inside, the center was alive with energy. Children and teenagers filled the rooms, some working at desks, others playing basketball in the open court. The air buzzed with laughter and conversation, a stark contrast to the pristine silence of Victor's estate. A woman in her 60s approached, her warm expression lighting up when she spotted him. "Victor," she said, pulling him into a brief embrace before stepping back to study Jasmine. "And who's this?" Victor glanced at Jasmine before answering. "Someone important." The woman's eyes twinkled with curiosity, but she didn't press. "Welcome," she said to Jasmine. "I'm Margaret. I run things here when Victor's too busy pretending he doesn't have a heart." Jasmine bit back a smile, watching as Victor shook his head with a sigh. "Margaret has no filter," he muttered. Margaret merely patted his arm. "It keeps you humble." Jasmine liked her instantly. Victor led her through the center, introducing her to staff members and a few of the kids who had grown up under the program. She saw the way they looked at him, not with fear or reverence, but with genuine respect. He wasn't just a benefactor to them. He was involved, present. "You come here a lot," she said as they stepped into a quieter hallway. Victor nodded. "As much as I can. This place gave me stability when I was younger. My father built it to make sure kids had a chance, even when the world told them they didn't." Jasmine studied him carefully. "You never talk about your father." His gaze darkened slightly, but he didn't shy away from the topic. He was a good man, strict but fair. He worked hard to build something meaningful, but he didn't live long enough to see it become what it is today. There was grief laced in his words, but also pride. "You kept it going," Jasmine said softly. Victor's jaw tensed, as if the weight of responsibility had never fully left his shoulders. "I owed him that much." She reached out, hesitating for only a second before placing a hand on his forearm. "You didn't owe him. You chose to do this, just like you choose to show up for these kids." "That's not obligation, Victor. That's who you are." His eyes met hers, something raw and unguarded flashing across his face. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then a voice called out from down the hall, breaking the spell. Victor exhaled, running a hand through his hair before turning toward the sound. "Come on," he said. "There's something else I want to show you." They spent the rest of the afternoon at the center, and by the time they left, Jasmine felt like she had uncovered a part of Victor that no one else had access to. He wasn't just the powerful businessman she had met weeks ago. He was someone who cared deeply, even if he didn't always show it. The drive back was quieter, but this time, the silence wasn't heavy. It was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. When they reached the estate, Victor parked the car but didn't move to get out. Jasmine turned to him, waiting. "I meant what I said earlier," he murmured. She frowned slightly. "About what?" His fingers tapped absently against the steering wheel. "About you being important." Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. "Victor, I don't do this," he interrupted. "I don't let people in, I don't get attached." Jasmine swallowed hard. "Then what are we doing?" He exhaled, turning to face her fully. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know that when you walked into my life, something shifted, and I don't want to ignore it anymore." Her heart pounded. Victor reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. "This isn't just about a job," he said. "It hasn't been for a long time." Jasmine knew the truth of his words because it hadn't been just a job for her either. She laced her fingers through his, squeezing gently. "Then let's stop pretending it is." For the first time since she had met him, Victor Langston smiled. A real one. And just like that, the walls that had once stood between them crumbled completely. Victor held Jasmine's hand as they walked up the grand staircase of the estate, the weight of everything unspoken settling between them. There was no longer hesitation in his touch, no more guarded distance. He had made his choice, and so had she. The house was quiet, the staff having retired for the evening. The soft glow from the chandeliers cast golden light across the polished floors, creating a warmth that hadn't been there before. Or maybe, Jasmine thought, it had always been there, waiting for them to acknowledge it. When they reached the second floor, Victor stopped just outside his study. His grip on her hand tightened slightly before he turned to face her. "There's something I need to do," he said. She nodded, sensing the gravity in his voice. "Then do it." Victor's gaze held hers for a long moment before he released her hand and disappeared into the study, closing the door behind him. Jasmine exhaled slowly, her heart still racing from everything that had transpired between them. She made her way to her own room, but sleep was impossible. Instead, she found herself standing by the window, watching the moonlight cast silver shadows across the grounds. Minutes passed, then an hour. Just when she was about to give in to exhaustion, there was a knock at her door. She turned, pulse quickening as she opened it to find Victor standing there. His expression was unreadable, but there was something different about him, something lighter. "It's done," he said simply. She didn't have to ask what he meant. "You're free of it?" she asked. He gave a single nod. "Completely." Relief flooded through her. Victor reached for her then, his hands resting at her waist as he pulled her close. "I don't want to waste any more time, Jasmine. I know what I want, and I know that none of it means anything without you." She searched his face, finding nothing but sincerity in his eyes. "Then don't waste time," she whispered. Victor didn't. His lips met hers in a kiss that left no room for doubt. It was deep, consuming, and filled with every unspoken word between them. There was no more hesitation, no more barriers. Just them, and this time it was forever. Days passed, then weeks. Jasmine no longer felt like an outsider in Victor's world because it wasn't just his anymore, it was theirs. She walked beside him, not behind him. They spent mornings in the garden, where he would slip his fingers through hers as they talked about everything and nothing. Evenings were spent in the library, where he would read aloud while she curled up beside him, their laughter filling the once empty walls of the estate. The staff no longer saw her as just an employee, they saw her as someone who belonged. And she did. One evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city, Victor pulled something from his pocket. Jasmine's breath caught as he opened the small velvet box, revealing a ring that sparkled under the night sky. "I don't want a future without you," he said. "Marry me, Jasmine." Tears stung her eyes, but she didn't hesitate. "Yes," she whispered. Victor slipped the ring onto her finger, then kissed her with the kind of certainty that left no room for doubt. They had found their way to each other against all odds, and this time there was no going back. Forever had never looked so beautiful.